We're going to have Amanda from UT Knoxville demystifying, kind of starting up a counselor advisory board. And we've got different perspectives on the high school side. We'll have Diane talking a little bit about being in the setting of a 500-to-1 student to counselor ratio and managing the work of 80 college-bound seniors. We'll have Juan from Westminster talking about managing a caseload with 200 students. And then I'm Pam from PACE, and we usually have about 115 or 120 per grad year. All right, well, I say we go ahead and get started. What do y'all think? Feels good?
Okay, yes.
Excellent. Well, welcome to the conversation about counselor advisory boards. Our goal is to really discuss how incorporating diverse perspectives serves students and also helps to meet enrollment goals. We're going to get started by introducing ourselves. Oops.
Hi, everyone. I will kick off the introductions. I am Diane Campbell, all the way from Colorado. So just getting used to this time change here. And just thank you, SACAC, for the opportunity for high school counselors to join for free. This is just incredible. But we wanted to follow the theme of what we're committed to. I raised 4 kids. They keep me busy. I don't have much for free time, but when I do, I love being a book nerd. And that's where I just find my zone and just really like to be informed. So thanks for joining.
And hi, everyone. I'm Juan Acosta from the Westminster schools. One thing I think that we're also going to include is, since it is about advisory boards, what boards we've served on or are currently on. So currently I'm on the advisory boards for University of Tennessee, Knoxville, for Mercer University and Mount Holyoke College. In terms of what I'm committed to, so to bring some levity to the morning, I'm committed to culture and specifically popular culture. And so about a year ago, we were all at home and many of us were, entertained by a little show called Tiger King. And with a lot of time in our hands, I had to do something for the fans and for the gram. And so, but really, in all seriousness, I think my commitment really is just to decompress. We do hard work. It's fulfilling, but it's not easy. And so at the end of the day, the way that I decompress is perhaps by, among other things, is by watching some trash TV, right? And I think that's okay. So really my commitment is to just decompressing and getting some time for myself at the end of the day.
Hey guys, my name is Amanda Wolk and I'm a regional representative for the University of Tennessee. I'm actually based in Virginia and work with students from Virginia and West Virginia. But I'm here today because I help coordinate our counselor advisory board at UT. So what I'm committed to, when I first met Diane, she enjoyed my Rothy shoes. And so I am committed to my shoe collection and always having a pair of shoes that matches every outfit.
I love it. All right, and I'm Pam Ambler from PACE Academy. I'm actually wearing some mock Rothys today. They're a little knockoff brand. Comfort counts in my world. But going with the theme for the SACAC conference and renewing our commitment, I, as a mom, am committed to allowing our daughter and encouraging her to dress herself every day. And really it's because I want her to be confident in making decisions, but there are some days where it can backfire pretty royally. And so the picture on the far right is our daughter Fielding. And we were just about to go to the grocery store and she said, I've got to change clothes really quickly, Mom. So she was dressed as Anna from Frozen and she found her favorite princess mullet wig. And we just lean right into that and we run errands in whatever outfit she wants so that one day when she has to make real decisions that matter, she'll have the confidence to do it. So with that, we're actually going to ask Dan to kick off a poll for us. So hopefully that will land in a way that you can see it and participate. And our aim is to use some of your feedback as we talk through counselor advisory boards this morning. for the wow factor, I'm going to keep it on our pictures. And then as I see the poll results dwindle a little bit, we'll then go to the next slide. I can see already 41% of you have voted. Thank you all for participating. It helps us a lot. All right, it looks like the votes are starting to trickle down. We'll give it another couple of seconds. I'm interested to see the split between high school counselors and CBO and IEC side with the college side folks. I think I almost anticipated it to be the reverse, but I'm just excited to have people in here, and I'm glad that we thought ahead to the diverse perspectives, as we've got stuff in mind for all audiences today. All right, well, I'm gonna move the slide. Okay.
So just to recap a little bit on what we have, it seems like we have a good amount of some high school counselors that are in attendance, along with some members from admissions offices, someone from a CBO, and then we do have various reasons of why you're here. So some of you have been part of an advisory board, others are looking to start one. Some of you would like to join an advisory board. And so hopefully we're able to touch on a lot of these points. But I guess the initial question to start with is, what is a college advisory board, right? And so an advisory board is a volunteer group formed to give advice and support. It could exist within nonprofit organizations. It could exist within larger corporations. It could exist within other aspects of a university. But for the purpose of what we're doing today, an advisory board, a college advisory board, or a college admissions advisory board rather, is one where you have different perspectives of people that work with high school students. And so it could be counselors on the high school side. It could be those that are independent educational consultants. It could also be those that work with community-based organizations. And they're brought together because their advice is needed on their admissions, recruitment, selection, and yield processes from the admissions standpoint. If we go to the next slide, or actually we'll stay here for a minute. In our session, we're going to dive a little bit deeper as to why this is important, who should be invited, and then circle back into ways in which an advisory board can be useful both for the university and for those that serve on the board. It's not a fly-in program. And I do say that because although there might be an initial aspect of that in familiarizing the board with a campus culture and community, it's important to know that the purpose of an advisory board should be to provide feedback and collaboration. It truly should be a working group that provides diverse perspectives. And so if we go to the next slide, you will see that some admissions are pretty clear with what they're looking for. Some admissions offices are pretty clear with what they're looking for on their advisory board, and they put it on their website. So we look at Florida Southern, for instance, they're looking for their board members to learn about several aspects of the university while providing critical feedback to better serve all students. If we go to the next slide, you will also see that for some of them, in many ways, it might mimic what they're looking for in an admitted student class, right? They want people from different parts of the country that will form and bring various opinions. And so if we look at Loyola's New Orleans here, for instance, they have 30 different high schools from 16 different states. Again, bringing several different stakeholders for varied voices at the table. And so I'm gonna hand it over to Amanda at this point, who's gonna guide us through some who, whys, whens of the board.
So the first question is, why have a counselor advisory board? Why is this going to be beneficial to your institution? Really, your goals are going to determine your whys, but I think some overarching themes, as Juan kind of touched on, is that we're looking for diverse perspectives. We also want to get the feedback from those that are on the front lines. You know, even though as the college side, we work with counselors and students every day, we work with them in a very different capacity. And so we're going to have some blind spots. There's going to be things that we really need help with There's going to be things, maybe we've done them for a long time, so we just assume that it works, or we're implementing things that we think are going to work. But the importance of having diverse perspectives is that what works for one student might not work for another. And so it's really great to have all of those voices at the table to kind of guide and shape what we're doing. I think that there are really kind of three buckets of whys. The first would be institutional or enrollment goals. The other one would be student-centered goals. And then finally, I think the one that's often overlooked is the benefit of a counselor advisory board for the counselors, both in a networking and professional development capacity. I think that's kind of overlooked, that this can be just as beneficial for counselors as it can be for the institution. So we're going to touch on that a little bit later, so I'll kind of focus on the other two. But when it comes to enrollment goals, what we're looking for, we can need help with our processes, our deadlines, what we're doing, our marketing, our communications, kind of looking at trends, because again, you're in the schools every day, you know what's going on, especially in the past year, trends have been very different, and it can be helpful to get that feedback from counselors on what's going on in their worlds and with their students. And then of course, we also want to work to being more student-centered, not just students, but also counselors, and really finding out what works and what doesn't work to kind of guide what we're doing in our offices. So next we'll talk about the hows of a counselor advisory board. What are some things that we consider when we're setting up a counselor advisory board? The size, how often we meet, the budget, the agenda. There's so many things to think about. And so we did a survey. I'm going to pass it over to Diane to kind of get a kind of see what some general themes were in the hows of setting up a counselor advisory board.
So what we did before we started putting all of our information together was send out a survey to a wide group of colleges who have current counselor advisory boards, public, small, private, mid-sized institutions, Ivy Leagues, and just gathered some information from them. We're not going to get into all of these details, but wanted to share with you some of the highlights as we unpack some of the key points from these results. But I think the common denominator in this too, just so that you know, if you are a college in this session who is thinking about starting a counselor advisory board, colleges are open to discussing and sharing and truly engaging in conversations to help you make your counselor advisory board successful based off of what they've tried that hasn't worked. So just so you know, these are just some key points. And as we move on, we're going to unlayer and unpack a lot of these more in depth.
So next we're going to take a look at some sample agendas, and I just want to talk about some key points when planning counselor advisory board meetings. I think the most important thing to think about is going to be the timing and the length of your meetings. Timing, obviously you want to try to have your meeting at a time that is not a historically very busy time for counselors. So avoiding things like admissions deadlines, AP testing, things like that. So you want to make sure you can have as much of your counselor advisory board there at a time. So try to be sensitive when you're picking what time to have it. Also be sensitive to the length of your meeting and the time commitments that you're asking for counselors. Counselors have a lot going on, and so you don't want to require so much time that it's not possible for them to be a part of the board. As far as meetings themselves, I found doing our counselor advisory board and also counselor events at my previous institution, 3 days seems to be a really great length. Start it on one day and give counselors the day to travel and kind of get there, unwind, and then do a fun activity in the evening. Also kind of be thinking about, you may have counselors coming from other time zones. And so you don't want to require a start time that is so early that you maybe have to get them there a night early, which is going to impact your budget because you have to pay for additional hotel stays, meals, things like that. So I think having people come on one day, doing an event at night, and then moving on for the next day to really be the day where you have the meat of your meeting and what you're doing. So also recommend building in times for breaks. Again, being sensitive to counselors' times, wanting to make sure that, there's a break to walk around or have coffee or even check email, because counselors still have to stay plugged into their full-time job while they're on your campus. So be sensitive and provide time for breaks. As Juan kind of touched on before, your counselor advisory board isn't really supposed to be like a fly-in. So the majority of the meetings should be work. I do encourage having some time for play, but making sure that you're not so much promoting your institution, but also just really getting to what you're wanting to work on that specific meeting. So you'll notice Juan dropped the link to one of our counselor advisory board itineraries. This one does kind of have more of a counselor fly-in feel because it was our first meeting. And so many of our counselors came, they had never been on campus before, they weren't familiar with the institution. Whereas if you look at Colorado College's sample agenda, that was a more established board. And so they really did a lot more work. So I think it's important to kind of have that mix of doing things so counselors can learn about your school, but also you learning from counselors. Something else to kind of keep in mind is like one thing we did, for example, was we did a campus tour that was to familiarize student or counselors with our campus, but also we had them do it from the perspective of being a visitor. So they got the swag bag, they got the information session, and we really asked for the feedback. How did this tour go? How were our tour guides? How was our tour program? So it's important to, I think, also engage campus partners and not only make your agenda about admissions things, but also consider other touch points that students are going to have so that you can improve your overall experience and not just the perspective of the admissions office. Also recommend kind of doing things around fun campus events or admissions events. So if you can kind of build a meeting around an open house or something where you can get feedback on what it's like to attend that event, or also just do something fun. Because again, remember, we want to have an equal mix of work and play. So for example, with our counselor advisory board, we took them to a basketball game. So if there's anything fun going on your campus, try to tie it in with the meeting so that they can kind of live the student experience a little bit more and also do something fun along the way. So next, I think, to me, one of the most important things about a counselor advisory board is the composition of your board. Again, we've talked about this multiple times, but you really want to get diverse perspectives. And so there's a number of things to kind of factor in when deciding who to invite. So I think some of the things we'll talk about is public versus private schools. I think it's important to have a mix of both, as well as in-state versus out-of-state. And then large feeder schools versus schools that you want to grow. It's really important to have a balance of these because, especially for having large feeder or in-state schools, those counselors might have over 100 applicants. So they're going to be really familiar with what the student experience is like when applying to your school and going through the application process. Whereas if you have out-of-state schools or schools that you're trying to grow, they may not have as many students that have applied. So they're kind of going to have a different lens than a counselor that's very familiar. I think something too, especially as our work has changed over the past year, it's important to incorporate not just school counselors, but also CBOs and IECs because they can bring a very different perspective to the table. As far as how to invite counselors, what we did for our counselor advisory board, which I think was very effective, was we got recommendations from all of our recruiters. We kind of told them what we were looking for in terms of public versus private, large feeder schools, things like that, and got their input on counselors that they knew and that they thought would be good for the board. This can also kind of help with your yield because if you're inviting counselors that you know, they're probably going to be more likely to attend. Something else to consider is counselors that have experience on other counselor advisory boards. For us, this was our first ever counselor advisory board, so we wanted to have counselors that had experience so that they could kind of help us to shape our board. This might not be a factor for everybody, but I think it can be something that's important, especially for those of you in the audience that are looking up to start a new counselor advisory board. Something else to consider in your kind of inviting process is, are you looking to invite certain schools or did you pinpoint certain counselors based on the perspective that they might bring? And be very transparent in the inviting process of whether this invitation is just for you. If you can't do it, we'd love to have you in previous or in future years. Or do you just want a specific school? Whether, if you've targeted them for certain reasons, whether it's a rural school or a school that has more underrepresented students. So just be very transparent in the invitation process. I know there were some counselors that we targeted for specific reasons, and then they ended up passing the invite over to somebody else in their office. And so when we kind of got to our meeting and looked around the room, there were some perspectives we were hoping to have that weren't there because the invitations have been passed on. So I think from the counselor perspective too, if you are invited to a counselor advisory board, maybe clarify whether this invitation is for you or could you pass it on to a colleague. And how many? I think that's kind of the magic question. I don't think that there's a right answer to that question. I think that budget is often going to determine how many counselors you're able to invite. I think you want to keep in mind that you want to make it large enough to have those diverse perspectives, but you also don't want it to be so large that some counselors feel like their voice isn't being heard. And also consider that not everybody can come all the time. So if you want to have about 20 counselors at a meeting, you probably need to have about 25 on your board, because there's going to be things that get in the way as far as being able to actually attend meetings. And I think it's also important to set attendance requirements. So like for us, we required that you came to our first meeting so that we really were able to set that foundation. So, you know, again, going back to kind of how many to invite, you never know how many you're going to get. When we started ours, I kind of pulled some other schools. I had one friend from a small school in the Midwest. They invited 100 counselors and they only had 10 respond. And so it can kind of be tough to figure out how many are going to respond. But one recommendation that I have, especially if you are targeting specific groups, as I mentioned, maybe rural counselors or counselors that are from areas that have a lot of underrepresented students, those are often the counselors that are going to have a harder time getting buy-in from administration. They're the counselors that are going to have a much larger caseload. And so they might not be able to come as often. So I kind of recommend having an A list and a B list. And if you are inviting a certain number of rural schools and they can't come in that A round, make sure that on your B list you have more rural schools so you can really kind of plug in those holes and make sure that you're getting those diverse perspectives. Last thing I'll mention is just think about who's getting overlooked often. I think we were surprised when we sent out the survey to how many counselors that we assumed would have counselor advisory board experience that didn't have that experience. And just sometimes it takes additional resources to get counselors from rural schools. They're likely going to be coming from airports where the tickets are going to be more expensive. So factor that into your budget because it's really, really important to include all of those different groups of people, even if it costs you a little bit more money. So the who is a very, very important part of counselor advisory boards.
All right, thanks, Amanda. And I really appreciate the intentionality with which she spoke about, making sure that there are actually diverse perspectives around the table. And it's funny how many overlapping moments we've had as we've talked about colleges building a freshman class and colleges that are building their advisory board. So think ahead to those budget constraints and make sure to be intentional about having all sorts of different voices at the room, because these counselor advisory boards truly are symbiotic. As this slide mentions, they're simultaneously beneficial. And so the first thing I wanted to mention was that every single person in our field and in this world is an expert in their own lives, right? Your day in and day out. And so never minimize the importance of your own voice. So in the event that you are invited to one of these boards, make every effort you can to advocate for yourself with your administration so that you will be able to take one of those seats at the table and have your voice be heard. We wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the college side benefits and then the high school side benefits, or those working in the CBO kind of realm, or also IECs, so those who are student facing in that nature. So first, I thought I'd kick it off by talking about the college side benefits. So colleges, as Amanda mentioned, they can benefit from our experiences because we're the ones who work directly student facing. And so we're the ones who they come to when they are confused about, well, what does test optional really mean? Can I actually trust this language? It feels misleading. Am I weakening my file or my chances by not sending my test scores? These are things that we see and hear on the day-to-day. Another example of the interactions we have with students that when we share these with college reps, they can benefit would be those self-reported kind of SSAR academic records that are part of some application processes. It's helpful for us to share with colleges how students engage with those kind of extra pieces of an application. And a third example would be supplements. Some of them feel a little bit hidden, certainly unintentionally, but it is part of the student experience that we can then share when we're around that table at a counselor advisory board. Another example of kind of the college side benefits that I think is really interesting. So before working on the high school side, I'll just mention that I worked at Emory, and any moment in our admission office where we all were forced to hit pause actually felt like such a renewal for the entire team. And so when you're hosting a counselor advisory board, really it's intended that everyone have all hands on deck. And it just gives you this renewed sense of, I love my team. So that's kind of an intangible but lovely benefit of CABS and interfacing with our colleagues from all the different sides of the table, so to speak. But switching gears and still kind of thinking of this symbiotic relationship on the high school side, I think one of the greatest things to mention is that counselor advisory boards typically are free to you as the counselor or the individual who works with a CBO or an independent educational consultant free professional development is very rare. We are so fortunate that SACAC has made this conference free to many of us who are on the high school side. But if we really look across the landscape, having free professional development is rare. So that's another reason to try and take advantage of the opportunity to serve on a CAB when invited to do so. A second idea that we had about a benefit that high school side folks receive as part of their participation on a board is just really that institution hosting. So in this case, UT Knoxville, for example, they're peeling back the curtain on their institutional priorities. And so whether or not, when you're on the high school side, whether or not you've ever served on the college side, it is so helpful to hear an institution speak in very specific terms about what their enrollment goals are and how they intend to meet them and how you can help them with those goals. And again, just thinking about my own experiences, I was at Emory for only 5 short years. And, there could be a moment where I might falsely assume that other schools meet their goals the same way that Emory did. And honestly, Emory's changed a ton since I was there. And so just the opportunity to be around the table and learn from my peers and my colleagues is absolutely a benefit that I enjoy when I'm on Mercer's Counselor Advisory Board. And then just one third thing that I wanted to sort of tee up as I'm about to progress to the next slide and hand it over to Juan is the professional relationships are also simultaneously beneficial. And so certainly it helps to have friends in the profession. They might give you advice on the way that they host junior meetings. You might hear about other kind of interesting college admission practices while you're traveling and being part of a board. But we really also wanted to talk about not just that type of relationship, but friendships are also bred from these counselor advisory boards. So Juan and I laugh so much together when we get to serve together on Mercer's board. And so don't devalue how fun it is just to serve in this way. There are so many benefits.
And so we reached out to a few people who had served in the past in advisory boards or who are currently part of an advisory board and asked them a few questions. So we wanted to know, first of all, what motivated them to join an advisory board. And so among the things that they shared were, at first they wanted to get a deeper understanding of the admissions process, right? And so this was particularly important for those who hadn't worked on the admission side. Some of us have, but not all of us have. And so it gave them an idea of what was happening behind the doors, if you will. And it also allowed them to best work with their students once they got back to their high school campuses or whatever organization they were working with. It also gave them a deeper feeling of connection with the admissions office and that particular school. And so this was important because, again, they wanted to foster that that connection that they had with them. So just joining an advisory board, they felt that they could acknowledge that. For many of the members of the advisory boards, it was also a learning piece, not just about the school itself, but in collaboration and learning from colleagues from different types of institutions than their own. And so it was really the idea of that knowledge sharing among colleagues that was important to them and that we spoke about a little bit earlier. I remember being on some boards where we were introducing Naviance to some counselors who had never heard of it or knew what it was. Right. And so, or SCORE was introduced at other boards. And so just the idea of sharing what you're doing with your own school now can go a long way with that professional development piece also. And then also some schools really just wanted to, or some members really wanted to serve that institution. They fundamentally believed in what that school had to offer. And so they wanted to be able to best serve and help them in their enrollment needs. We also asked them a little bit about whether or not they felt that their voice was valued as part of the advisory board. And so a couple of the things that they said, one respondent said, it's nice when colleges ask for input and act on some of those suggestions. It makes me feel like I am part of a team working to help students find their fit. While another added, I believe the value is multidimensional. CAB members gain a more intimate understanding of the institution while developing and fostering relationships with admissions professionals. The expanded knowledge of the institution and strengthened connections bring value to the students and school the CAB member serves. Meanwhile, CAB members add value to the institution by sharing perspective, experiences, and advice to help the admissions professionals understand the challenges and opportunities from the secondary school side.
And here I'm just going to highlight, as Juan had mentioned through the survey, all of these results and goals were taken from the voices of counselors who have served on counselor advisory boards. And there's just some incredible common themes. And I like what you said, Juan, about the Naviance piece, as I feel like some counselor advisory boards I've served on, although there's an agenda, when we derail from the agenda, sometimes they have just been the most enlightening, great conversations for both sides, just to say, hey, let's just pause and really have a moment to work in a space that we normally don't have the opportunity to, where both sides can grow. So we just wanted to highlight a few of the goals, again, just mentioned by some counselors through the survey that said, please, if you are creating a counselor advisory board or have one, just keep some of these goals in mind, as colleges have found that these work best, but also when we're as counselors, when we're away out of the building and committing our time, because yes, it's more than a fly-in, we really want you to take us below the surface of what your campus has to offer. There's nothing we love more than sharing with our other colleagues about what we learned about your campus. Trust us, like we are blowing up our phones and coming back and so excited to share with students about your campus. I'll sit there in a counselor advisory board sometimes and just make a running list of students that I can't wait to go back and share, because there's something I learned on a much deeper level that can really connect that student with your campus. So really make sure that your agenda is going deeper than what you would normally offer on a fly-in. And the other thing to remember too is be open to constructive communication and conversations around what you can improve on all scopes of how you're recruiting students. I mean, that's the goal, is to get students to apply and potential enrollment, but counselor advisory boards where you can have those honest conversations about what you can improve for high school visits, programs, your marketing pieces that you're using. And it's not a way of counselors coming into your space to say, give you a laundry list of everything you're doing wrong, but just truly listening about what works for us when we're working with our students and families. But also we want to hear the same for you. It's a two-way street. We want to know how we can really improve communication for you on new programs that you're bringing in to your campus. If it wasn't for the UTK advisory board, I wouldn't be able to encourage some of my students to apply for their leadership program. I had no idea that existed. So there's just those deeper, valuable programs that you learn that you can connect your students and families with. And again, it's just all really is so critical that you're setting up this communication ahead of time so that counselors know their true commitment. Is this a 1-year term, 2-year term? So that we can advocate for ourselves to administration to say, yes, I'm going to be out of the building, but here's when I will be. So it really just makes the whole process seamless as we advocate for ourselves to be at your campuses and learn.
And so some of the things on the slide we've already mentioned, but I think they're worth reiterating, right? So I think with the first point, with engaging with the different reps that come to your high schools, that come visit you. As mentioned earlier, we were surprised when we did send out the survey and asked people to talk to us about who had been part of an advisory board. We had many people, and even in the poll earlier, we had many people respond that they had never been asked, right? And so we were a little dumbfounded because there were people that we thought certainly had been part of several advisory boards. But the best way to maybe get yourself on an advisory board is to really cultivate those relationships with your reps. This way they get to know you, you get to know them, they get to learn what your voice is and value your opinion. And so if there's a school that's building an advisory board or adding to their existing one, they could think of you when deciding whether or not they might want to invite you. This was just mentioned earlier as well, but if you are invited, advocate for yourself with your administration, with your district. As mentioned before, it does come at little of any cost to your school or your district, but there are many benefits that can come to you in terms of you advocating for your school, you advocating for your students in this process, and just learning more about what goes on behind the scenes and being able to contribute to the work your students are doing. Many of the advisory boards will give you homework to do, right? And it's important to complete the pre-work. They're doing it for a reason, right? So if they're sending you packages of things to review, make sure you're doing what they're asking you to do. More importantly, though, make sure that you're able to contribute and make suggestions to what that assignment might be. They're selecting you for a reason, so it's important for you to understand that your voice is important, it is valuable. They're not inviting you just so they could hang out with you. I mean, that could be part of it, but at the heart of it, they want your advice, they want your suggestions. So make sure you're doing the work and are open to expressing your voice as well. And then mention membership terms and rotations. I think this is important because they are selecting a group of people for a reason. Some members might rotate off, others might not. I think it's important to know that if they're selecting you, they want you to be part of that entire term. So I'm going to pass it over to Pam now to talk about maybe what you shouldn't do if you're invited to an advisory board.
Yeah, thank you, Juan. I think the most important thing is just to remember that the advisory board isn't about you. And so not you personally, Juan, it might be about you and how much fun you are. But generally speaking, if you're invited, make sure, like, let's say on the agenda, it says that the bus is leaving at 8 a.m. Well, guess what that implies? Like, get your coffee in your system by about 7:30. If you've got to load your bags onto the bus, make sure you've allowed a cushion and there's never a moment where you're making that board less about service and more about you. So it's also important to remember that while the college is absolutely seeking feedback from diverse perspectives and hoping to make a change, it's important that you remember not to take offense if your ideas are not implemented in the next admission cycle. In fact, it's important to remember that a counselor advisory board is one of many boards that likely that admission office is answering to. There could be a board of regents. There's, of course, a board that guides the overall university or college. There can be all sorts of different kind of priorities and voices that are not in that room, but are in fact in the heads of the admission folks who've hosted you. So remember to just offer what feedback you're able and to posture as a listener. And if you are one of those people who is a 30-year veteran, Amanda was mentioning they really needed to target some people who've served on previous boards so that they could kind of establish the flow of their own working board. Remember that if you are one of those veterans, to be intentional and seek out someone who's younger at the table and perhaps is doing a lot more listening than they are contributing, invite them into the conversation. And remember, there's no one person who's the most important person in the room. And in fact, if we all listen twice as much as we speak, but remember to share our voices, then everyone in the room will stand to benefit. So that kind of segues really nicely into just saying, counselor advisory boards work. I think we've smiled a lot in this presentation, so you can tell that we have fun with one another, and you all already know that. It's SACAC, right? But here's some just anecdotal evidence of boards in action. So one example that comes to mind is serving on Mercer University's advisory board. There was a moment where they gave us some pre-work and some ideas about their School of Engineering. But then when we got together, we really were asked to share feedback around how they might share their story. And so that feedback was very much incorporated into not only the development of the website to feature that School of Engineering, but also in their brochures and their mailers. So it feels good to then see your comments kind of come to life and in some cases, hold that road piece in your hand that mentions that moment or that resource that they want to showcase. Another great example is in bullet 2, just thinking in terms of, on the high school side, we hear from students about how challenging admission decision rollouts can be. And that feedback, when we shop that right to the counselor advisory board, the folks on the admission team are hearing us. And so there's a great example that UGA shared with us that when it was obvious in their early action round that a student wasn't going to gain admission, it was through the counselor advisory board that they realized they should, in some cases, go ahead and deny some students who apply EA rather than drawing that process out. And I know that Juan also wanted to mention something about EA or ED programs and his own experiences as well.
Yeah, and just piggybacking on Pam's point, based on some of the survey results that we got a lot of feedback with how advisory boards had worked. And for some of them, at the board's suggestion, they pushed back when decisions were released. And so later in the day, perhaps towards the weekend. At Mercer, in the past, they had a rolling admissions decision. And so at the board's suggestion, we recommended they consider early action. And they did, which they implemented. And I believe that did help with some of their enrollment goals as well. There was another institution who was previously early action, and they moved to early decision. And as part of that process, they were able to meet their peer institutions that look similar to other schools they were hoping to be like. And similarly, they became a little bit more selective, which was something that they were hoping to do. Also with testing policies, it's important to know that, our voice, we're working with students and dealing with them, that's important as well. And so some schools, even pre-COVID, shifted to maybe looking at either test optional or test-free policies at the suggestions of the advisory board. I know Dickinson College cleaned up their website and made it a lot clearer for families and counselors what it meant for them to be test-free or test-blind, as they call it. And so these are some of the ways in which it has made it easier for the advisory boards to help these admissions offices. And I think Diane's going to touch on the next point.
Yeah, just was going to wrap up this slide as we have a few more minutes to wrap up some questions too. Just the impact of scholarship programs. I truly appreciate and value the conversations around affordability and transparency and those hard, critical conversations. But just one example was with University of Arizona's Counselor Advisory Board. We as counselors just said, what you're offering is not really providing access for lower GPA or for students with lower GPAs. So we had those conversations around what is weighted GPA versus an unweighted GPA, but make that super transparent so students know when they land on your webpage, it makes sense for them so they understand some of those critical points of affordability right on. So I think on the last slide here, we're just going to move on to the benefits for counselors. And just as a public high school counselor for many years, the Counselor Advisory Board was truly my first opportunity. And I know a lot of my friends, it's been their first opportunity and exposure and access to anything admissions. As a high school counselor, I have not worked in college admissions. So as the opportunity arose for me to really sit behind the scenes and understand what went on, it really gave me that voice and insight when working with students and families early on to say, I understand how admissions decisions are made. I really know what goes on behind the scenes. And just as Pam and Juan were mentioning earlier, it's that free piece that I did not receive, although I have my master's degree in college in high school counseling. There was no class on how college admissions. So again, there's just so many benefits for high school counselors on all levels from all schools, as we mentioned. But again, it just fosters those relationships. And we just hope that this session really showed you the benefits for both sides. It really is just the place where counselors on both sides of the desk can sit in a space that's truly honored in our professional conversations and candor, because we're all truly working for one goal, and that's to provide opportunities for students and families. We want to share your colleges in the best we know how. These are opportunities. And I think we'll answer a few questions, I guess, maybe. But we want to encourage you to reach out to, I know Amanda has shared any resources that you want if you're starting a counselor advisory board. Please reach out. Here's our contact. And if you're a college and you want to learn more from Pam, Juan, or myself on what's worked and what's haven't on a deeper level from counselor advisory boards, don't hesitate to reach out to us. I see there's a question on here, a list of colleges and universities that have a CABS. Yes, we did talk about that. I mean, just some that I've served on real quickly. Colorado College, Colorado State University had an inaugural one a few years ago, but I know they're not offering now. University of Oregon. So we could definitely reach out and let you know some others, but hopefully you found some valuable tools if you're starting one or already have one and need areas of improvement. We thank you all for joining such a fast session. But feel free to reach out to us. Any other closing comments, team? Anything else? Okay. I think we're good. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you all.
Thanks, y'all. It was fun.
All right, great job. I have to move on because I got to start another one, but have a great day.
Down.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank
bet.
you.
All right, we'll talk soon. Bye.